Okay. So, okay. Off you go.
Right. Now, hold on. Can everybody see okay? Can you give a wave if you can? If you're seeing okay? Brilliant. Excellent.
Yeah, all good, all good.
Excellent. So here we are, Crofton Park in World War II. Very, very familiar photograph there that some of you may have seen. It's used a lot in books, Heinkel 111 flying over the Thames. But if you look at that photograph, actually, the railway line that's running across there, the bottom, oops, sorry, the railway line running across the bottom, which then loops down, this is the line to Crofton Park, to Brockley. Brockley is just about a centimetre below on this map, as it were. This plane, following the trail of this plane a few seconds ago was directly over Crofton Park. It was, you know, had it chosen to unload its bombs at that point, we would have really known it. But let's go back. With war approaching in the late 1930s, from 1935 onwards, the government prepared for war, and it's one of the falsities of the Second World War. People say, "Oh, we weren't ready for it." Actually, in terms of civil defence, we had made an awful lot of preparations. You can see in front of you here a scene that may be familiar to you all. It's Ladywell Bridge. Shelter for 700 is still there now. It regularly gets painted over, but works its way to the surface again. And as you can see, an arrow beside it. And where is this shelter for 700? Well, if you go to this point of the bridge, it is the, the western side of the bridge. And you find that arrow, you find the next pier is actually a set of steps going down onto the railway line. And that's exactly where this shelter was. It was the railway arches themselves, one of them, not the one the railway goes through, of course, that would have been a bit disastrous, but one of the side ones, there were a whole series of them, was bricked up at the ends with and used for a shelter for 700 people. So that was one local shelter. This was one of the things the local councils had to do. They had to provide air raid shelters for their population. They also had to provide ARP services, etc., which we will look at. So I can't move on to the next one.
Oops, okay. There we are, it's these.
Oh, so it's right, okay. Right, you can see here a list of just some of the shelters in the local area, and you can see there were various sorts. We had brick surface shelters, and we'll look at those in a moment, but there was two in Brockley Groves, one on the corner of Elsie Moor, one on the corner of Horsemondon. There was one at Stondon Park, there was one in Holdenby Road, there was actually two in Stondon Park. There were basement shelters. Now, basement shelters were fundamentally just places that had large basements that were happy to throw them open to the public. And so you can see there's a shop in Comerford Road, which could take 470 people. The numbers behind the shelters, or next to the shelters in this list, are the amount of people they could take. 470, that's an awful lot crammed into a shop shelter. And the crypt at St Hilda's could take several hundred as well, and would take several hundred. Not only was it safe, but also there were a lot of people. People preferred to be in the big shelters than the little shelters, because you had a lot of support. There were sing-songs taking place. There were on the big ones, there were facilities provided, often a canteen or somebody making tea or whatever. Sorry, I'm being heckled from the side. Yeah, okay. And the great thing about the crypt at St Hilda's is in 1940, the vicar does have a little moan in the local magazine that, you know, we have it today, but it was still going back in those days. In fact, it was going from the very start of St Hilda's. The magazine was being brought out. And he has a little moan saying, would some of the gentlemen amongst the shelterers mind helping us out by doing a bit of fire watching on the roof while they're at it, or up in the tower while they're at it. So yes, we had that. And then there are trench shelters. And in Guy's hospital ground, we had timber and slab shelters, and for 600 people in the, up by Stillness School. And of course, at the bottom there's the railway arches. So an awful lot of public shelters. In much of Crofton Park, the gardens are not big enough for Anderson shelters. The Anderson shelter, it's no good just having a tiny garden with an Anderson shelter. The Anderson shelters had to be built at least 15 feet away from the house, so that if the house was hit and collapsed, it wouldn't just crash down and crush the Anderson shelter. So for many people around here, you didn't see Anderson shelters because there's a lot of small gardens here. In the next picture, you will see a trench shelter. Now it says Guy's Sports Field. That's slightly misleading. The shelter you're looking at is in Reading, actually. It's not in Guy's. I have not, unfortunately, come across any photos of the Guy's one, but it is very, very similar in the way it's being built to the way that Guy's ones were built. Basically, what they did was as you can see in the first shot, they dug a very, very long trench. And then around the outside, they put timber supports. And then in the second picture, it's the same shelter. In the second picture, they have lined the walls with corrugated iron. And they're about to, you can see they're filling the sides in with the earth that has been dug out. And then last of all, a concrete slab is cast on the top. And the rest of the earth piled over it. And as you could see, they would take 450 people in Guy's. Surprisingly, people were very keen on them. Local civil defence. Well, Lewisham was split up into 9 areas, and each area, districts as they were called, we were straddling B district and G district. B district was Upper Brockley Road and G district was Honor Oak Park. So Crofton Park straddles those 2 areas, and you can see there each of the districts would have an ARP warden's post, and you can see the warden's post for the districts or the regions that actually covered Crofton Park. So we actually had 9 area wardens posts in the area, from right down the bottom around Wastdale Road, Ravensbourne Crescent, right up to the top Adelaide Avenue and Beecroft Road itself. And you can see in the next picture, one of those posts, post G108 in Monten, it was on the corner of Monten Road and Ravensbourne Road. And you can see all of those people behind there are the post wardens. If you look, it's quite interesting. The inner group have a dark blue serge uniform on. These are the full-time wardens. The posts were manned by 2 groups. There were the full-timers who worked full-time, obviously, and paid to do it. And there were the part-timers who would do 3-4 hours an evening, say 2 evenings a week. And you can see they're the ones around the outside that are in the more sort of scruffy overall type things. They didn't get proper uniforms. Some of them, as you can see right at the back, didn't get any uniform at all except a helmet to wear. Those are not, the ones at the back there, these 4, sorry, you may notice they've got a different helmet on, a sort of more domed helmet than the other ones. These are the fire guards. And the fire guard were the ones who rushed around putting out fires, as you will see. On to the next slide here. This is all from Lewisham. These are all photos of Lewisham ARP. The top left-hand corner, we have some SP, you may notice, stretcher party. These were people that went and did first aid on the bomb sites, but at the same time, if the people were seriously injured, they would carry them off in a stretcher to an ambulance and be taken from there to a hospital. The lady on the top left, top right, should I say, is actually a British Red Cross worker. But if you look very carefully, I'm not sure you can see it on this photo, but you may notice that on her chest, she has a rectangular badge there, and that says Lewisham. She is Lewisham Red Cross. Down at the bottom there on the left, we have Deptford Report Centre. And if you notice on the wall, there is a list of roads, and they're all roads in Deptford. Deptford and Lewisham at that point, although they were all part of the same borough really, were split up into two groups for the sake of ARP. They worked together, but they were very specifically separated, and would be very proud of their Deptford badges or of their Lewisham badges. And bottom right, we can see again some SP workers, some stretcher party with the mobile units. And you can see the mobile units are not the kind of ready-built ambulances we would be using today. They are vans and trucks and lorries that have either been commandeered or loaned in the evenings, because of course most of their work took place in the evening. And what would happen was that the local builders would use it during the day, but in the evening they would pass the keys over to the ARP, who would use it as an ambulance at night. So there's some of the local civil defence workers that were going on. One of the things they spent a lot of time on was fire, because it was very obvious from the word go, and this is 1936, that the normal fire brigades were not going to be able to deal with the kind of conflagrations that would be started by bombing. And so they introduced a thing called the Auxiliary Fire Service. And the Auxiliary Fire Service was a bunch of peacetime volunteers who carried on with their ordinary jobs, but once or twice a week would train for as firemen. And as soon as war broke out, they reverted to becoming full-time firemen, but auxiliary firemen. The London Fire Brigade men at first really didn't have a great deal of time for them. They thought they were amateurs and so on, but they proved themselves to be incredibly important. But the firemen alone weren't going to be good enough for that, because one of the most dangerous weapons or effective weapons that the Luftwaffe used was not huge great bombs, but small bombs, about a foot long, incendiary bombs. One plane could carry 600 incendiary bombs, and each one would start a fire. Now, when you consider that an average size large raid on London was by over 300 bombers, 300 by 600, that's an awful lot of fires that one raid can start. And we saw the effect of that in the pictures that I'm sure most of you have seen of St. Paul's ringed by fire and blaze on the 29th of December 1940, when the big attack on the City of London took place. Luckily, the fire brigade, not only the fire brigade, but the wardens were there. You can see at the bottom there, two Lewisham, these are Lewisham wardens, they're actually training at this point, but two Lewisham wardens using what was called a stirrup hand pump. And you can see the one on the right is pumping away like mad, and the one on the left is filling up the container with water, continually bringing new buckets. And in fact, there is a third member of the team who is on the end of the business end, as it were, of the pipe, spraying the water onto incendiary bombs or whatever. And you can see, sorry, at the top, the stirrup pump here, this is a cardboard one. I have a metal sign as well, that you place them in your window to say that you owned a stirrup pump. People were encouraged to buy their own stirrup pump. They cost all of 25 shillings, £1.25p as it would be, £1.25p today to buy a stirrup pump. It was a fairish amount of money back then, but it wasn't going to break anybody's bank. And often neighbours would club together and buy one between them and so on. But you would have that sign in your window, and if a small fire broke out, people would know where to come to borrow your stirrup pump. Sorry, move on to the next one. But here we have the Auxiliary Fire Service. Now, locally, a lot of schools were turned over to the auxiliary fire service. Of course, we know why the children were evacuated, and we'll be looking at that in a minute. But specifically in our area, Gordonbrook School became an auxiliary fire station, and the picture on the top there of the 3 firemen with their fire engine, by the way, the car they're standing in front of is pulling, you may notice, a fire pump at the back. And so many auxiliary fire pumps were not proper fire engines at all. They were ex-taxis and things like this that would pull little pumps off to the scene. Those 3 are stationed at Gordonbrook School. That is, and you know it is, because if you look on the side of the pump, right over at the side there, it says 46X. And 46X is their station number, and 46X was Gordonbrook School. Below we have a photo that I took a few years ago, 20 years ago, when our children were there, of the entrance to Stillness School. And if any of you know Stillness, you may recognise that's just inside the entrance. And you can hardly see it at all now. Time has worn it away, but you can just see in this photograph that there is the word watchroom there, with an arrow beneath it. And watchrooms were in fire stations. That is a auxiliary Stillness School auxiliary fire station, and it's pointing the way to the watchroom. The watchroom is where the guys would be sitting, waiting for the fire to happen, you know, until it happened. They would be sitting in there, and it told you where to go. But anyway, so there's some of the local fire stations. One of the first things that would have happened as things began to heat up was that in 1938, September 1938, we had the Munich crisis. Hitler was threatening to invade Czechoslovakia. We and the French had promised to defend Czechoslovakia. It looked as if we may well be at war in September 38. And at this point, gas masks were issued, not at the beginning of 1939, but at the end of 1938. Most people had their gas mask given to them in late 38. And you can see, if you look halfway down here, this is a note, the one on the right, a leaflet from Metropolitan Borough of Lewisham, and halfway down it says the distributing centre, I can't talk my teeth coming out, the distributing centre for your house is Stillness Road LCC School. And so schools, once again, were used as distributing centres for gas masks and so on. You go along and be fitted out with your gas mask, because they came in several different sizes, because gas masks had to fit children all the way up to very large adults. And so you got them in different sizes, and they had to be fitted to you and so on to make sure they were airtight. And here we would go on, we'd have gone along to Stillness Road to be kitted out with our gas masks. This is 1 year later. This is September 1939. War has not yet broken out. This is the 1st of September 1939, 2 days before war breaks out. And you may recognise this. This is Sevenoaks Railway Station. And Sevenoaks Railway Station was the kind of masthead, as it were, for the evacuation of South East London School out into Kent, etc. The school you're seeing, as you can see by the banner that was being carried by the teacher at the front, and also you may notice on the armband of the teacher right over on the left-hand side there, LCC 03, 1103 as it were. Each school had a number, and this is Caldecott Road School, which is in Denmark Hill, or was in Denmark Hill. Had this photo been taken just 20 minutes earlier, it would have been Brockley Road School coming through. Brockley Road School came through 20 minutes before these photographs were taken. And so many of the children from the area were going through Sevenoaks Station. This is on the 1st of September, 2 days before war was actually declared, but the day after Germany had invaded Poland, which was the spark that was going to set us off. But government waited a couple of days to get the children out. And here you can see a list of all the local schools from Addie and Stanhopes down to Stillness Road. And you can see where they went. Every single local school was evacuated, except one. They were nearly all closed. Gordon Brock was evacuated, but not all the children went. It was not compulsory. You didn't have to send your children. You were encouraged to send them, and quite a few did go. But what happened was that obviously they didn't keep schools open for just a few dozen pupils. And so one school in an area would be designated the emergency school. And all the kids who stayed behind would be sent off to that school. And in this area, it was Gordon Brock Road was the emergency school. And so although many of the children from there had gone, there would still be children from all over Crofton Park turning up to have the last bit of their education there, as it were. On Friday the 29th September, we're now at war, but there's nothing really happening. We're in the period known as the phony war. There's no bombing taking place, very, very little happening at all. But on the 29th September 1939, it was National Registration Day. And the whole country was registered. And it was registered for several reasons. First of all, they needed to know exactly how many people lived in the country, who lived where, how many men, for instance, were old enough to be called up, how many women were old enough to be called up, because they would introduce a form of conscription for women later on. And they were preparing for this. But to do this, you needed a proper register of who lived in the country. Also, the other thing was, of course, that they were going to be bringing in food rationing. And again, for food rationing, you really need to know how many people live in this area, how many people live in that area, and so on, to make sure they get the amount of food they need. And National Registration Day took place on 29th September 1939. Now, if you think about it, you may think, yeah, but they could have got that information from the census. But of course, the last census took place in 1931. They happen on every 01, don't they? So the next one we're going to have will be 2021, next year. But of course, by 1939, the information on the 1931 register was very much out of date. Not only that, half of it didn't exist. There had been a fire at the store where they kept all of the stuff, and they'd lost half of the results of the 1931 register. So they needed to have a much more up-to-date registration, and that's what national registration was. Everybody in the country was registered, and everybody from this was issued with their identity card. As you can see, when I say identity card, there are several variations here. And it's worth mentioning that the standard identity card and the first standard identity card is the lower one on the left. It has nothing but identity card. You may notice it's surrounded by ones that say withholder's description, with endorsement, with police endorsement. Those are ones that for people who needed to go into classified areas and secret areas and so on, and they would have a special card that had their photograph on and so on, make it much more difficult. The ordinary identity card didn't have anything on of that nature. All it had was your name and your address and your national registration number. Didn't have your age, didn't have a description, didn't have a photograph. Basically, it was just so that you could do, well, what? If you look on the front of those four over on the right-hand side, they've all got the same, fundamentally the same stamp on. MF, NRMF, if you look at them, National Registration, Ministry of Food. Because when they brought in rationing, and they would be bringing it in very soon afterwards, in order to get a ration card, you had to present your identity card. Problem in those days, of course, was no computers. How do you know whether somebody's already received a ration book or not? You know, they could come around to the back of the queue. You're not going to spend hours trawling through the list to see whether that person's name is already on there. You wouldn't have had time. So basically what happened was you came with your identity card, and they stamped it to show that you had received your registration, your ration book. If you notice the top ones, it's very clear on the top ones, the colours of the stamps are actually different. You've got a different colour stamp each year, so that they could tell whether you'd had this year's ration book or not. And we move on to the ration book. And the nice thing is you can see both of these are very local. One's from Shardlows Road, SE14 from Deptford. The other one's from Crofton Park Road. These are very local. Not only that, inside the cover, you had to write down, because you had to register with a particular grocer, a particular person to sell you meat, a particular person to sell you vegetables, and all these kind of things you had to register, so that each shop would know exactly how many people they've got to supply, and that the government could make sure that every shop had that amount of food. Because one of the things about rationing is that if you turned up at your designated butcher with your ration book, they had to supply you with your allotment of meat. And so the government had to make sure that every shop had that allotment. So you can see, you know, local ration books, but they're all the same throughout the country. They just have different names and addresses on. And now we come back to this picture, because of course we are the phony war did not last for long. Well, in fact, it lasted for just over a year. In terms of bombing, bombing of the capital began on September the 8th, 1939. And we want to look now at the effects that bombing had on the area. We can be quite specific about this, because if you go along to the Lewisham archives, you will find that every house, virtually every house, there are a few missing, but virtually every house in Lewisham has a card like this. And this was because the government, we were all part of a government insurance scheme. If our house was hit, we wouldn't have to fork out to have it rebuilt or done up, depending on how badly hit it was. And you can see this is a house in Brockley Grove, this particular one. Notice at the bottom their classification: A, totally destroyed. If your house was wiped out, flattened to the ground, it would be an A incident. B, so badly damaged that demolition is necessary. Now those are just the first two grades. The next slide shows you the other side of the card, and the other side of the card here talks about CA, CB, D and W. CA, seriously damaged but capable of repair. CB, seriously damaged but capable of repair but uninhabitable. So you would have to be taken off somewhere while it was being done. D, slightly damaged. And W, broken windows only. Now, I'd like to put that into some sort of perspective here, because slightly damaged doesn't sound like a great deal. But here we have a description by Mr. Park, who was an ARP messenger in G107, who we saw earlier. He was an ARP messenger, would rush around taking messages, a young lad. And he wrote about one day, he wrote his memoirs, and in it, there's where he comes home from helping to put out fires elsewhere, only to find that his house has been bombed that night. And he makes this little description. This house was now shattered out of recognition. No windows, slates, plaster dust and broken glass everywhere. Our front window had been blown out of the wall and was resting on the settee that Mum had purchased a few weeks earlier. When I looked it up, that date, that house was a D, slightly damaged. So you can see that slightly damaged is a kind of relative term. It means pretty badly damaged. And indeed, if you look the back here, you can see, if you have a good look, you can see that this house, the one we're looking at here in Brockley Grove, was damaged on 5 occasions. Each of the Ds down the side is a different incident. And indeed, if you look beside each one is the date, 41, 44, 44, 44 and 45. In fact, the house was damaged an awful lot by V1s and V2s, but there was some bomb damage as well. And then there are lists of what's gone wrong: roof, walls, floors, ceilings, windows, chimney stacks, joinery. It goes on. And you can see that an awful lot of different damage was taking place. So when we talk about the D, bear in mind that when it says slightly damaged, it's a lot more damage than we might expect it to be nowadays. This is the area that I have been able to cover up to now. Unfortunately, I've not finished Crofton Park, and I haven't got the lower end, and also off to the east, you know, Bexhill Road and roads like that. Unfortunately, I was spending some time going to the archives, doing a road at a time, and of course, the latest incident that we have, you know, the virus has meant that I can't carry on with that at the moment, but it will be done one day, hopefully. But you can see here that there are an awful lot of roads. In fact, there are something like 58 roads there, and an awful lot of buildings. There are almost 4,000 buildings involved. So we are talking about quite a swathe. By the time I'm completely finished, it will be about 90 roads. What am I talking about? 90 roads and about 9,000 people, 9,000 buildings, which would translate to 20-odd thousand houses, which really shocked me recently to realize that's the size of a small town. But if we look at what we're going to do now is look at some of the bombing of the local area. And not all the damage, by the way, and that's the reason why we're looking at this, not all the damage was done by the Germans. We had our own anti-aircraft sites. Our particular one was, as you can see on the letter, to Private Marshall. Now, Private Marshall is actually the lady on the right in the top picture, Dorothy. And Private Marshall, Molly, as her family called her, and as we called her when we met her, unfortunately, very sadly, Molly, who was in her 90s, was one of the early victims of the virus locally, I'm afraid to say. But there's Molly at the top there. She was on the anti-aircraft guns, as you can see from this letter, the 565 MHAA battery. That is the 565th mixed heavy anti-aircraft battery. Mixed means there were men and women on the site. The ATS and the Royal Artillery were working together on the site. And there she was working on these anti-aircraft guns. There were 4 of them, and they were in on the top of hilly fields, spaced around the school mostly. And unfortunately, in amongst the records, we have, as you can see at the list to the side there, an awful lot of the roads were damaged by shrapnel or by anti-aircraft shell. Shrapnel was when the anti-aircraft shells went off in the sky, huge bits of shrapnel flying around that would, of course, cause real damage to a plane if they hit it. But of course, if they didn't hit it, gravity took over and they came flying down, and some people's roofs were hit by shrapnel, often quite small shards, and they would sound like a kind of heavy rain or hailstones on your roof. But sometimes they didn't go off at all. And that's the 2AA shell. An anti-aircraft shell is fired up into the sky and fails to explode. And again, gravity takes over and it comes crashing down. And next thing you know, you've got a huge, great hole in your roof, and you're cursing the Germans, but you then find out it wasn't the Germans at all, it was us. But there we go. Another thing was balloon damage. We had balloons on Stondon Hill, down the road there, Codrington Hill, you might call it. And there was a balloon group there. And you can see in the picture some of these balloons. You can see how big the balloons actually were. And what were the use of balloons? Well, the fact was that the balloon itself wasn't much use at all, but it was the way it was held up that was useful, because it would be trailing below it would be a steel hawser about 1.25 inches in diameter, solid steel hawser that was holding it to the ground, as it were. And the balloon would stretch that out. And the thing was, if a German plane, or any other plane for that matter, came flying under the barrage balloon and hit that steel hawser, it would literally rip your wing off. And so the Germans were forced to fly above the barrage balloons. And of course, if you're flying that high up, A, it's very difficult to be accurate in targeting, but B, you're much more vulnerable to the anti-aircraft guns who can see you than if you're skimming along at rooftop height. But the only problem was that on occasions, the balloons actually broke free and flew off, trailing this thing behind them. Some of you may have seen the Dad's Army episode where a barrage balloon actually breaks free, and of course Private Jones, or Corporal Jones, finishes up hanging from the cable as it goes across the fields. But it's based on reality. Those things did happen. And of course, 1.25 inches diameter steel cable, if that hits your roof, is going to do some damage to it. And you can see Rizzerdine Road, Stondon Park, Tacknell Road, all of these were damaged by balloon cable at various times during the war. But here we go, the Blitz is starting. The Blitz, as I mentioned earlier, starts on the 7th of September 1940. And we're looking at somewhere you may not recognise, you probably wouldn't recognise, and this is St Cyprian's Church, Brockley. Now, where is St Cyprian's Church? Well, if I quickly go on to the next picture, you can see it. There we are at the top of Hilly Fields, and we're looking out over Crofton Park, and there it is right in front of you. It's on the site of what is now the new girls' school. This was St Cyprian's Church, and this was one of our early churches built around the turn of the 19th, 20th century. And on the very first night of the Blitz, it is hit by incendiary bombs and explosive bombs and is completely destroyed on the very first night of the Blitz. In fact, it is destroyed within hours. The Blitz begins at 5:30, St Cyprian's is gone by 12:30. But that wasn't our first actual incident. The first incident, as you can see, the Blitz began at 17:30. At 17:35, 2 houses in Sevenoaks Road, so 5 minutes into the Blitz, 2 houses in Sevenoaks Road are damaged, not destroyed, but they are damaged by incendiary bombs. And so we're in it from the word go. We then have what's called the Big Blitz. And the Big Blitz is the attack that goes on against London for 2 months or so. Only London is being bombed in that time. And right at the end of the Big Blitz, because what stopped the bit, not stopped it, but what brings it to a close is when they move outside of London, and they do that with Coventry on the 15th of November. Some of you may no doubt have heard about how Coventry was virtually razed to the ground by their attack. But 1 week before, on the 10th of November 1940, 344 and 342 Brockley Road are destroyed. If you look at the top picture there, Duke Brothers. In fact, it's not Duke Brothers, it's, Freeman Brothers. Yes, it is Freeman Brothers. But Duke Brothers was such a well-known shop that you can see that they're saying we used to be Duke Brothers, but the word Duke Brothers is in bigger words than Freeman's. But that is next to the railway bridge. And indeed, if you look right at the edge there, you can see a little brick pillar with a concrete cap to it. That is still there. That is still the very end of the railway bridge at that point. See, just on the end there, right at the left-hand end. And below it on the, oh, moving ahead like that. Below it, you can see what is there now, and that is Phil's car lot. The two houses on the end totally destroyed and not rebuilt indeed, and the car lot was built there. End of December, we had the huge fire raid on the Blitz. We didn't get by without being hit by that. You know, we had quite a few incendiaries over this area, but it wasn't our worst raid. Our worst raids come later next year. First one is the 16th of April 1941, known in London as the Wednesday raid. There were three hugely heavy raids on London. The three heaviest raids on London, besides the one on the City of London that I talked about in December, were 16th of April 1941, 19th of April 1941, and May 1941. There were three raids right at the end of the Blitz. And most people consider, most historians consider them as a smokescreen, actually, because in June 1941, they invade Russia, and they, you know, secretly invade Russia. Russia up to that point had been their ally, and it's generally believed that these were a smokescreen to look as if they were still heavily attacking Britain, when actually they were already turning their attention towards Russia. But if you look at the photo there, you can see that some of those buildings, the ones on the left-hand side, are very similar. And the ones in the distance, the church, etc., and Sid's you can see on the corner there, or what would become Sid's, those are similar. But the ones on the right, no, wait a minute, that's not like that at all. Not now. Now, why not? Because the Germans are now dropping a new weapon in November. And we received some of the early ones. And you can see it in this picture what they're dropping. This is a British bomb disposal squad. The two men in army uniform are bomb disposal officers, the rest ARP and police workers. But this huge thing in front of you there is what was called a landmine. And I know it's weird because nowadays we think of a landmine as being a small plate-like thing that you stick in the ground somewhere. But no, these were originally German magnetic sea mines. They were dropped around the coast of Britain, and you didn't have to hit it to send it off. What you had to do was to come near it in a large steel structure, a boat in other words, but a large boat, a battleship or something like that would send these off. Only trouble is some of them fell on mud flats, and we learned how they worked. And we were able to stop them blowing up ships by a method called degaussing, where they passed large cables around the outside of a ship, and they passed a huge electric current through those, or a large electric current, and it had the effect of cutting down what we call the magnetic signature of the ship. And so suddenly the Germans are dropping these sea mines to no avail whatsoever. And the Germans find out about this. And so what they do is they change the fuse over, and they drop them on parachutes as bombs, fundamentally. And we received some of the first ones. They land on those buildings over there on the left, right rather, and there we have the scene today. You can see Sid's, etc., in the background, and the church, and you can see the buildings over there on the left-hand side, but the ones on the right there, completely gone. The flats are there now. Not only that, but look at the corner, the corals, very clearly a post-war shot. Indeed, in the next shot, you'll see what was there before. Gill Brothers Furnishers. They are on the corner of Adelaide Avenue there. And you can see in exactly the same spot today's Joe Corals. Again, totally flattened by these, by the landmines. The landmines carried over a ton of explosive, which was exactly the same amount as was carried by the V1s and V2s. So they would have the same effect as a V1 or a V2. In fact, in some cases, they were more dangerous than the V1 or the V2, because unlike the V1 or V2 that came down at a hell of a speed and buried itself in the ground before the explosion happened, these came down on parachute, and therefore they would not bury themselves in the ground. When they went off, they would just clear the ground all around. And you see where the corals is. Also on the next shot here, we see the flats next to it. And you see that it's not just the flats on the road that have been cleared. It's 3 layers of flats you can see back there. Indeed, there was a whole row of flats along, houses, should I say, along Ivy Road there that were destroyed. 6 people were killed in Ivy Road by those bombs. Here we have our worst bombing night, the 10th of May 1941. Remember the really big raid before the attack on Russia. And you can see there, I need to make sense of what you're looking at. You can see several roads, not all the roads, but these are the roads that were badly hit. And what we have here is 3, 7, 10, 15, 23 roads. A third of the roads in Crofton Park. Look at Buckthorn Road, the first one. What does those figures represent? 20 damaged, 25 seriously damaged, 11 so seriously damaged that you couldn't live in them, and 1 completely destroyed. And that's just Buckthorn Road. You can go through road after road to see the real extent of the damage that was caused by this one night's raid. And we were attacked on many, many nights, but this was our heaviest bombing raid, and I stress bombing raid. January 1943, here's some other evidence, as it were. January 1943, we have the corner of Howson Road and Kneller Road there. Clearly those 3 houses which were there, all gone, and again 2 people died in those houses. March 43, you can see halfway down the road, these ones in the middle here, which are post-war houses that have filled in a gap there. But for us, really, we went through all that, but the really bad time for Crofton Park was in the later part of the war. On the 13th of June 1944, the first V1 hits London. And just 2 days later, the 15th of June, our first V1 lands. But luckily that one wasn't too bad. The 16th, however, 16th of June was a really bad one for us. You can see here, obviously, the cemetery, and this is the Brockley Road side of the cemetery. But what's this building? Well, it's not there anymore. It was the Catholic chapel. Each of the various denominations had their own little chapel in the cemetery itself. This was the Catholic chapel. It's next to what is still the Catholic part of the cemetery. But this was just part of the, not the main hit at all. The main hit was on the other side of the road. But it's one of the pictures we have of the damage caused by that one hit. What was hit was the school, Brockley Road School. You can see in the black and white, the slightly grey picture, the old school that was there, Brockley Road School. If you notice today's picture, you will see the end of the buildings are exactly the same. The Brockley Road shops on the other side of Breakoff Road are exactly as they were in that earlier picture. But of course, on the other side of the road, the school has been totally taken out. Now, that could have been a problem because children were coming back to school by then, but luckily it happened in the middle of the evening, at night, when there were no children on the premises. However, having said that, the premises, like most schools, were dual use during the war, and our premises were used by our local Home Guard. It was the Home Guard headquarters. And you can see here a plaque from St Hilda's Church, the LDV, in memory of them. Then we have these 3 lieutenants, a sergeant and a corporal, members of E Company, 57th Battalion, County of London Home Guard. Why is it only lieutenants, sergeants and corporal? Because of course it is the headquarters. The ordinary guys aren't there, they're out patrolling, etc. But back in the headquarters, we have the senior officers of the local Home Guard. E Company of the 57th Battalion. 57th Battalion was known as the Catford Battalion. Next to it, you can see my dear wife Carol wearing, modelling a 57th, a Catford Battalion Home Guard overcoat that somebody from Beckenham very, very kindly gave me. And that is what you would have seen on our local Home Guard. These were all killed when the V1 landed on the school. Here, the next picture here, you may recognise, if you look in the distance over to the right, this is, of course, those are the Waits Estate, and this is Courtrai Road. It's 1947, and it is the unveiling of the memorial that you just saw. And these are the ex-members of the Crofton Park Home Guard, have turned out, not in uniform anymore because it's been disbanded, but the gentlemen you can see there standing up are the members of the Crofton Park Home Guard, and the man in the middle with the military uniform is Lord Mount Evans, who was the head of civil defence in this area. But he's come along to unveil the memorial. Let's just go back to the damage that one V1 can cause. If we look at the buildings, say the one on the right, the left rather, at the top there, you can see the change in the colour of the brickwork. That is where that top half of that building, and this is on the corner of Beecroft Road, opposite the school as it were, where the whole of the top of that building has been sheared away by the blast from that V1. The two windows below are in Brockley Road, and you may notice the dental hygiene shop that is still there today, or is there today rather. But look at that weak point. The weak point, of course, is between the windows. And you can see in both cases, the whole of that centre section of the brickwork has been blown out by the blast of that V1. And you can see the damage that a single V1 can cause. Here's another example. This is the United Wesleyan Chapel. Don't know whether anybody knows where this is. There's a little bit of it left. It's Ackroyd Road. If you look, this is on the corner of Ackroyd Road and Brockley Rise. The thing to look at is these two bits at the side here sticking out, because when we look at today's picture or the next picture, we can see them there. There's the two bits at the side. This is Brockley Rise. You can see what that has done to a whole, one V1 once again, to a whole flight of shops and houses, and the church in the distance. See, the church has lost all its roof virtually. You can just see the timbers of the gables of the roof. Sorry, moved on again. But that is today. Underneath there, you can see the council building that is underneath, but you can see the damage that one V1 could do, and these were hitting us quite a lot. Why were they hitting us a lot? Some of you may know about Garbo. Garbo was a Spanish man by the name of Juan Pujol, and Juan Pujol worked ostensibly for the Germans as a spy. But he was really working for us. He was a double agent. He was sending them wrong information. And part of the information he sent them was to say the V1s are all overflying London and coming down in Hertfordshire. So they shortened the range because they weren't by this time sending any planes over. They didn't know where they were landing. They thought they must be a slight technical hitch, so they shortened the range. And that meant instead of hitting the centre of London, as they actually were doing, they were hitting Croydon through to Brockley. And that's where we got hit an awful lot. Croydon was the worst hit of all the V1, V2s. That was all the ones that were aimed at central London were hitting there. Here, one last reference to St Hilda's. You can see the old vicarage at the top and the new vicarage at the bottom. They look quite similar, and indeed they were built upon very similar lines, but the vicarage, as you can see on the 6th of August, down in the corner there, 6th of August 1944, it was destroyed. It was hit once again by a V1. Unfortunately, just 2 weeks before, the vicar had written an article in the local newspaper saying, if you're bombed out of your house, we've got loads of room at the vicarage, come and stay with us for a while. A little bit tempting fate, I think, but there we go. That's what happened to the vicarage. The V2s, of course, began to arrive that month in August. And these really were nasty. Where the V1s, you had some warning, They, you know, they would tootle along in the sky and you would hear them coming. And as long as you heard them coming, it was fine. It was when the engine cut out that you knew you were in for trouble. Indeed, one local girl did say to me that during the war, they had a little skipping rhyme that went, first you hear the engine, then you hear it stop, then you count to 15, then it's time to drop. Because once it cut out, you knew it was going to come down and explode. And here is our worst V2. 11th of February 1945, 11th February, just weeks before the war actually finishes. And here we have a beautiful scene, the corner of Brockley Grove. Not there anymore, unfortunately, but the corner of Brockley Grove, this is about 1908, and there are these really quite nice houses on the corner there. But on February 1945, a V2 lands on the corner of Brockley Grove and Marnock Road. And what we now have today, we now see what is there today, the flats on the corner. Those flats were on the site of a V2 explosion. And we have a really quite rare photo next. Here we have that same scene in 1946. And they cleared the site of the buildings. And like so much of Brockley, there were prefabs put up. And these are the prefabs. You can very much see them on the corner of the building. Indeed, if you look at this strange kink in the, kink in the chimney that you get on these end buildings. Sorry, there it is. Again, the kink in the chimney. It's an odd one. You don't usually see that, but very much easy to line it up. In summing up, there were 97 air raids. That's bombing raids between September 40 and May 44 on this area. Almost 100 air raids. There were 18 V1s landed on our area and 7 V2s. In total, of 59 roads and 3,775 houses, which I mentioned earlier, we suffered 97 deaths. There were 41%. If you count those figures up, you can see that comes to 41%. 41% of the houses in the area were seriously damaged. And indeed, 25%, 1/4 of the houses in the area were so badly damaged that they were either flattened or had to be pulled down. That's, you know, how serious it was. And I want to finish with, again, another little quote. And this is from a lady who was a small girl at the time living in Crofton Park and was evacuated down to Bristol. But she came back in 1945, as so many people did. And this is her memories of what she saw when she came back. There was tarpaulin over many windows and scaffolding outside to hold the framework together and prevent further collapse. Many were uninhabitable. I and other children played hide and seek in them. Our house was miraculously still had the decoration on the top of the grey slate roof, but it was the only one. The beautiful stained glass in the front door had been shattered totally. Many people I had known, including my Sunday school teacher, had been killed. This was a region that was really heavily hit by the bombing, but as you can see, specifically by the V1s and V2s. I hope you've enjoyed it. Has anybody got any questions? Can you
unmute it?
How
Right.
do we unmute?
Okay, there we go. Oh gosh, sorry, Norma. Asked. Okay, asked to unmute. I'm just trying to unmute everyone and making a mess
Don't
of
you
it.
press ask?
There we go. There we go. Right.
Hello?
Any questions? Unmute. Unmute.
That's
Asked to
no, that
unmute.
was.
Oh, sorry. Asked to
Muted
unmute. Oh gosh, I'm doing it the wrong way around.
That one is muted still.
Yeah.
No, this one
Yes.
is muted
Yes.
still.
This is the way to do it. Unmute. There we go.
There we go.
Right. I think you're all in.
No,
Oh,
no.
That was fascinating. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you. Whereabouts do you live?
I live on Hilly Fields.
Ah, right. Well, you know, I have a lovely map, 1945 of Hilly Fields, and it shows all the prefabs around there were 2 lines of prefabs all the way around the edge, up the road at the side and along the road at the bottom. But also it shows that the Royal Artillery camp at the top, where you were still not allowed in. So we've got some nice Hilly Fields bits.
If you go on the Facebook page as well, there's and you scroll back to last summer, I think it was. There's the marks.
Oh yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Rather lovely.
Yes, but the nice thing about this, and they actually had their own addresses. The nice thing about the map is each one is numbered, and there was a name for them, and they're called something like Hilly Fields Cottages or something. But it's a postal map, because obviously there are so many there that people are sending letters and stuff, and so you can see exactly where they all were.
Wow. Yeah.
Anybody else? Well, I hope you all enjoyed it.
Yes,
Great.
thank you very much.
We will be doing some more talks on the local area over the next few weeks.
Good. When you get round to it, I'd like to know what happened to the 2 houses which were bombed in Little Newhurst Road, the cul-de-sac.
Ah.
Oh, I have to look up.
That
2 houses.
No, I can't look that one. That's one of the ones I haven't yet done. But as soon as I find it, I'll put that at the head of my list. Newhurst Road. That's the first one to do.
I'm grateful.
You're welcome. Thank you very much. Hope
Thank
to see
you.
you all again next
Thank
time.
you. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank
Thank you.
Right, that's it. Oh, well done. Well done. Right. Zoom meeting. End meeting. Press stop recording. Now everyone's going to give me swearing as I try and stop this. More. No. Where it says meeting, it should say end meeting.